"Get out! You are trash!" The words landed like stones against the tile. They were simple, brutal syllables, sharpened by a son's impatience and thrown with the certainty of someone who had never been told no. Maria Madalena straightened as if the kitchen air had become cold and brittle. For a heartbeat, she remained inside the doorway, a thin figure framed by afternoon light, aprons stained with years of dinners, and a pair of hands that had mended, fed, and forgiven more often than anyone could count. Behind her, 3 faces, each carved by a different kind of hard, watched. The youngest looked away first. The middle one's jaw tightened. The eldest folded her arms, as if the house itself belonged to her by inheritance of entitlement. Outside, the rain began, a steady, stubborn drizzle that quickly turned the yard into a smear of mud. Maria crossed the threshold with 2 battered suitcases, as if they were all the world contained. One suitcase had been her companion for years, scuffed leather, a lock patched with string, holding nothing of great monetary worth, but everything she considered necessary: a change of clothes, a small tin of sewing needles, a faded handkerchief embroidered by a woman who taught her to sew by lamplight. The other case, thinner and lighter, carried what remained of memory: a few photographs curled with age, a stack of yellowing envelopes bound by a rubber band, and an odd wooden box she had never meant to open, but had kept close like a secret prayer. She stepped into the rain with a quiet that surprised those watching. Where others might have raised their hands in protest, called the neighbors, or flung back a cutting word, Maria moved with the slow composure of someone who had been practicing leaving for a very long time. Her wet hair clung to her temples, the water traced the outline of her cheekbones, and a single droplet threaded its way down the collar of her dress before the hem soaked and clung to her calves. The son, Michel, stood near the sink, panting with self-righteous anger. He had the look of someone who believed posture and a sharp suit could compensate for anything else. His voice, when he used it, trembled less from fury than from the terror that had become tightly coiled beneath his skin, the terror of losing control, of having his private chaos exposed. "Don't come back," he barked. "You embarrassed me. You are not welcome here." "Get out," Marina added, nails white against the marble counter. She could not bear the thought of other people seeing the life she had built, one polished as if varnish could hide every scratch. Juliana, the youngest, looked between them as if hoping for a miracle that would make the room right again. Her eyes were damp, but she did not step forward. Maria did not turn. She walked down the stone steps into the rain, the 2 suitcases making a soft, repeated sound. Her sandals, worn thin at the heel, sloshed through puddles. The rain blurred the world into gray and silver. Streetlights hummed. Cars passed by like distant storms. Across the pavement, a bus shelter offered a place to stand, and she paused beneath it, shoulders trembling with more than cold. Neighbors peered through curtains. A neighbor woman crossed herself, muttering. The street dogs went quiet. It was a small town in its own way. Everyone could see everything, but not everyone would say anything. For Maria, the humiliation was not new. There had been 1,000 small shames over the years, the times she had accepted second-hand clothes so her children could look neat at school, the afternoons she sold a cherished pendant to buy a book. Still, the sound of her son's verdict, trash, caught at something ancient and tender, and it made a small, wild thing in her chest ache. She waited until the rain had soaked through her dress, until the wind had raked the hem so that the colors of the fabric ran together, and then she turned the suitcase handle and began to walk. Each step was no longer made in haste, but with intention, as if she were tracing a path she had walked in her sleep for years. If you want to see how justice is served, keep watching. She walked until her knees were muddy. A bus passed, and she rode until the town shrunk to a smear of lights. She moved without a destination, guided only by the thin hope that someone somewhere would do what the children no longer could, treat her as a person, not as an object to be discarded. 2 streets down from where she had lived, under a sagging porch painted the color of old lemons, a couple noticed her. Lucia was standing on the small step, sweeping rainwater away from the door when she saw the silhouette of a woman walking toward them with 2 suitcases. Lucia had the face of someone who had learned to greet life with hard hands. Antonio, her husband, had the quiet steadiness of someone whose laughter rarely came but was always warm. They hailed her without much ceremony. "Madre," Lucia called, the word rolling from her tongue like a question and a blessing at once. "Come under the awning, you'll get sick." Maria offered a faint smile. "Thank you," she said. Her voice carried a softness that surprised Lucia and made Antonio set aside his broom. The couple took the suitcases without asking, guided her to a chair by the stove, and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders as if she were a guest after a long pilgrimage, rather than the mother of people who had abandoned her. Their house was small, but it smelled of stew and soap, and the kind of clean that came from someone who had earned the right to be generous. They pressed a cup of coffee into their hands and sat, not prying, but attentive as if to the weather of their heart. Maria told them little. She spoke in fragments, about the rain, about the house, about the fight, each sentence a ribbon that floated away in the warm, lamp-lit room. Her hands, calloused, soft at the fingertips, folded over the wooden box she had kept so close. Antonio, who had worked as a mechanic before an accident slowed him down, asked a question he meant with civility rather than curiosity. "You're alone?" "Yes," Maria answered. The word had a simple honesty to it, and in it lay a history, years of choosing to put the needs of others before her own, of sleeping lightly so that she might rise early enough to prepare the day for those she loved. Lucia, who had 2 sons of her own and a calendar full of neighbors to watch over, made them give Maria the only bed in the house. She told Antonio to prepare a bowl of hot broth, and the couple spoke to one another in brief sentences of mutual care. They did not ask where she would go next. For them, being kind was not an extraordinary act, it was a mode of life. When she placed the wooden box on the table, its grain was dark and worn, the lid secured by a simple latch rusted at one corner. Maria's fingers hovered before they opened it. There was a pause like the intake before a prayer. Within the box lay small things, a pearl button that had belonged to a dress long given away, a pressed violet with petals browned by time, a slender silver bracelet engraved with a date, and a packet of letters bound with thread. She lifted a letter and ran her thumb over the faint handwriting. The ink had faded, but not beyond legibility. Names pulsed in the margins, the one that had once been her own family name and the one she had taken when she married, the signature of a man who had loved her enough to make choices that would shape decades. Lucia watched her with an intensity that was not nosy, it was neighborly wonder. "You should rest," she said gently. "You can stay as long as you need." Maria shook her head. "Just a few days," she murmured, "until I can think." Yet even as she said it, she unfolded another letter and let the paper blush beneath the lamp. Lines of a life unspooled, a story of choice, a name once famous in circles Maria had left behind, and references to a family she knew she had been part of once, in a life that had been both hers and not hers. She read a note written in a hand that seemed to hold both ceremony and sorrow, a mention of a house with high windows, a surname that had towers of marble attached to it, an uncle who had written letters that stopped after a certain year. There were terse mentions of a chest kept in a room that had once been hers by birthright, words about documents, papers, and a will. For the first time in many years, the story of her life as a girl emerged from the fog. She had left not because she wanted to. She had left because of a choice that had been made in the name of love. In the letters, there were explanations she had been too proud to demand as a child, details she had never sought, and a name that now seems both strange and familiar. The revelation was not a lightning bolt. It arrived like the slow rising of dawn, unwanted yet inevitable. Maria understood then that the wooden box was not only a private museum of memories, it was a map back to a life that had been, in some legal and social sense, hers to begin with. Back at the house she had left, the mood had curdled into a different kind of storm. The children, Marina with her nails always lacquered to match her outfit, Mikel with his quick temper and clearer sense of dominance, Juliana with her nervous hands, had assumed that throwing their mother out would be a simple, tidy solution to a domestic friction. They had believed too easily in the rightness of their anger. But the world has peculiar ways of arranging consequences. That evening, a luxury car pulled up to the gate, and a man in a sober suit walked up the path with a leather portfolio under his arm. He introduced himself as Dr. Stephen Almeida. He spoke precisely, unfolding a presence that smelled faintly of expensive cologne and older money. "My name is Stephen Almeida," he said, and there was in his demeanor the unmistakable air of someone accustomed to making legal matters neat for those who could pay for neatness. I represent the Cavalcante family. The house seemed to draw a breath. Marina tried to practice the smile of someone who had never been surprised by a sudden turn in life. Mikel folded his arms and asked without warmth what the lawyer wanted. Juliana, who had more softness in her bones than either sibling, stood frozen near the doorway. Dr. Almeida placed a sealed envelope on the kitchen table, as if laying down a challenge. This letter is to inform you that your mother, Maria Madalena, has been identified as the direct heir to the estate of the late Augusto Cavalcante, he said. The names were like pebbles dropped in water. Each syllable rippled. There is a will. The process is formal. Reports are being prepared. The words seemed to ricochet off the marble. The house, which had hummed with the comfortable confidence of those who assumed control over their private world, suddenly felt cataclysmic. What estate? Marina stammered. How is that possible? Mikel began, but his voice died under the weight of something he had not foreseen. In the past, the family name had been a quiet shadow at the edges of their lives. It had been a story told softly at dinner about relatives who had prospered elsewhere. It had never been an open ledger many had expected to read. When the lawyer mentioned the estate, his words painted a picture: an expansive property with rooms that looked out over orchards, investments that included care facilities and small medical ventures, and a foundation whose name had been associated with community works and hospitals. Dr. Almeida spoke of a seals folder, of formal procedures, and of legal delays that had finally concluded with an executor's signature. This is not a rumor. This is the final will.
For the children, the shock had the stuttering quality of a piano string snapped mid-note. A new fear opened in their chests, less the fear of loss than the fear of having to reckon with past behavior. They had sent their mother into a storm, believing her gone to some small private poverty. They had not imagined she might have a claim to a fortune that would make their scorn read as a scandal to the outside world. Outside, the rain beat against the windows, a steady percussion that now seemed to mock them. The neighbors looked on from across the street. Someone moved to close the curtains, as if shielding the house from public spectacle. Marina's hands trembled as she thought, in a flash, of the parties she had planned, the friends who might judge, the opportunities now endangered by a stain of shame in the family name. Michelle tried to count options with the flat, clinical thought of a man who had always measured loss in transactions. Juliana, whose hand brushed the envelope as if understanding it might burn, only felt the sudden cold of consequences. Dr. Almeida watched their unraveling with a kind of professional patience. He had seen the way human emotion rearranged even the most sensible of people. He pushed a card across the table and told them the law was clear. The executor would seek to locate the heir before probate completed. Should the heir be found and accept the terms, the estate would be distributed according to the will. Should she be absent, the court would follow the provisions written in the document. "Is she missing?" Michelle asked. The word missing hovered like a question that had never been intended for them before. "Not missing exactly," Dr. Almeida answered. "Unknown at present. But the documents indicate that she is alive and that her acceptance is required for certain allocations to be carried out. Time is a factor." They argued among themselves. The points they raised were self-preserving, as arguments tend to be in households unused to public reckoning. Marina insisted they call every relative, every friend, every person who might have remembered their mother's name. Michelle subscribed to the urgent logic of containment. They should control the narrative, find her quickly, and ensure whatever happened next preserved the family's reputation. Juliana, with her hands clasped as in prayer or regret, wanted only to find her mother and undo the day with a magic she did not have. They left the house in a flurry of movement, the three adults more like flocks of birds scattering than a family bound by kin. They split the tasks, one to call the neighbors, another to search through cupboards for any signs Maria might have left, one to ask the driver to take them to the places where she had once worked. The city received them like a careful accomplice, a surgeon's light exposing a wound that had been kept behind closed doors for years. Word traveled. A neighbor, Donna Concesan, who had been a fixture on the street for decades, someone who knew when a baby was born in a house 2 blocks over and when a marriage would fail, came forward with fragments of memory. She remembered the young Maria arriving years ago, the way she had carried herself with a modest dignity that contradicted her poverty. She recalled an old brawl over a parcel of land that had once belonged to the Cavalcantes, and how rumors had swirled of a lost daughter who had chosen love over the dirge of status. The girl left because she married for love, Donna Concesan said, hands motioning stories in the air like someone turning the pages of long memories.
She wanted a different life, but I always thought there was more to her story. I thought she had something of that old house in her chest. As the children moved through the town like people possessed by a single purpose, the mood shifted from panic to a more complicated mixture, shame leavened by a fierce, almost hungry hope. What if the will meant redemption, not only in material terms, but in social ones? What if the man behind the estate could erase every slur they had cast upon their mother's name? In the space between despair and possibility, urgency raced. They found clues quickly: a bus route the mother had once taken, a street vendor who remembered the woman with the wooden box, the names of people in the small networks of care who often took in the lost and the weather-beaten. A teenager at a cafe remembered seeing a woman, an older woman, carrying 2 suitcases and looking like she had run out of places to go. Someone else pointed to the house of Antonio and Lucia, mentioning a woman who had taken a stranger in out of the rain. The search consolidated into a single direction. They took cabs without noticing the cost, asked questions without thinking of the small kindnesses they had once expected from the world. The town, gossiping and humane in equal measure, offered up its tiny evidences. At Lucia and Antonio's house, Maria sat at the table, the wooden box open between her hands. The letters were whispering with a history she had kept folded within herself. She read through lines mentioning dates, names of places she had not seen in decades, and the weight of decisions that had been made in drawing rooms she never entered. One letter bore the signature of a man whose surname matched the estate the lawyer had mentioned. The fact hit her with no trumpets. If anything, it arrived with the quiet of an old morning where doors close softly and the day unfolds. When she lifted her eyes, she found Lucia watching with a curiosity that had softened into a protective kind of hunger. Antonio stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, his face lit by a faint, awkward empathy. They would not be the ones to tell her how to proceed.
There were choices to be made, legal ones, social ones, and above all, choices that would concern Maria herself, who had carried a life of made decisions with a tender stubbornness. That evening, the phone in Marina's bag kept ringing with half information and rumors. An executor had been assigned. The press had not yet arrived, but a social reporter from a local paper had called asking pointed questions. The family had been given a deadline by which the heir needed to be located before certain public notices were issued. The lawyer's office had been unhelpful in its certainty. They had the will, they had a name, and they knew that locating the presumed heir would set in motion a legal choreography from which there would be no easy stepping back. "I can't believe this," Michel muttered as they sat in the car, the city unfolding like a map of possibility and regret. He rubbed his forehead in a quick, everyman gesture that had always been his attempt at stoicism. If she accepts, everything changes. Maybe it's a mistake, Marina said, but she did not sound convinced. Her thoughts went to charity galas she had planned, to donors who liked their causes to be unblemished by scandal. She imagined a mother who could call her into the parlor, and the scene made her hands cold with a dread she could not quite name. What none of them could guess was the deeper thing that slept beneath the documents and the estate. A woman who had, for reasons of her own heart, once renounced the claim quietly, choosing instead a life smaller in material means, but large in sacrifice. Maria had remained in the place she had married into, not merely because she had nowhere else to go, but because staying had been a choice. She had chosen love over the brassy lures of wealth. She had stitched that choice deep into her flesh. And yet the world had a way of returning debts, not always by measurement, but by irony. The will was not vindictive. It was not a tool of revenge. It was perhaps the formal instrument of a past that had decided in its own slow tempo to reassert itself. For Maria's children, the will meant the reappearance of consequences in a life they had assumed was safe from such reckonings. Late that night, while the rain began to slacken into a distant memory, Maria sat by the small window of Lucia's house and read the oldest letter again. It described a room with tall windows, a name that had been part of banquet lists and whispered introductions. It mentioned a decision, years ago, to step away. "I must go," the letter had said in its old ink. "I will choose love, even if it means giving up the house." The voice on the page was not bitter. It was deliberate. The choice had been clear then, and it remained clear now. She slept in a chair by the stove that night, waking intermittently to the creak of the house and to the hum of a town that did not sleep easily when its secrets stirred. When she rose in the morning, she wrapped the wooden box in a cloth and put it back into the lighter suitcase. There was a practical quality to her movements. She had nothing to hide of the past, but she had reasons not to broadcast every memory right away. Meanwhile, the siblings' search gained intensity. They visited the hospital where Maria had once taken them as children, the shop where she had worked, even the church where she had sewed altar cloths. Each stop yielded small, stubborn facts and a single growing piece of shame. A woman from the local market remembered Maria's hands, how they had always been ready to help fold crates or patch a torn bag. A former neighbor remembered how years ago Maria had refused to return to the family line when offered a position in the house her birthright had once placed her in. She said she chose another path, the woman told Marina, as if the words might be a talisman against guilt. She said family is where love is, not where money is. The children's journey across the town had become a public walk of repentance and calculation. People watched. Some offered quiet sympathy, others whispered. When they finally arrived at Lucy and Antonio's modest porch, breathless and flushed, the scene that met them was not what they expected. Maria stood alone on the step, the wooden box at her feet. The box seemed to anchor her like a small, secret island in a sea of gossip. She looked at them not with fury, but with a tired curiosity that was almost like a kindness. "Mother," Juliana whispered, and the words slipped into the air like a question and a prayer combined. Michelle reached for her hand before he could think to be ashamed. For a moment, time held its breath. The city outside the little house hummed with the rhythm of life. Inside, 3 adults and an old woman stood on the cusp of a decision they could not yet name. Dr. Almeida's letter had made a formal claim and had set a procedure into motion, but the legal machinery could not immediately annul the quiet history that had placed Maria at this modest table. Nor could it account for the long strings of decisions that had led to the moment when the children, who had once been sheltered by her, were now pleading, some with tears, some with frantic bargaining, for a mother who had been reduced, by their own hands, to a figure who might or might not accept a fortune. They spoke then, haltingly. Marina offered apologies that sounded like negotiations. Michelle promised things, promises that had more the ring of bargaining than of repentance. Juliana offered an apology that scraped from the bottom of her heart. Maria listened with a face that held many things: the ache of being pushed away, the weariness of a woman who had borne more than her share of living, and a small, fierce dignity that did not allow her to be made into a spectacle.
"I left because I wanted to be the kind of mother who put her children first," she said finally, in words that were not loud but had the authority of history. "I gave pieces of myself away so that you could have more. I did it without asking for praise, because I believed love does not store receipts." The admission was not a confession. It was a statement of how she had lived. In that sentence was the tilting of a scale, a quiet mathematics of sacrifice that weighed more heavily than any ledger. "What about the will?" Marina asked. Her voice had a brittle edge now, an edge sharpened by the knowledge that their social reality might be rewritten. Maria looked at the wooden box, at the letters that had guided her through a life of choices, then at her children. "I have letters," she said, "and I have the right to decide. I do not make decisions to punish. I will not make decisions out of spite." Her eyes, when she turned them to each of her children, were steady. They held briefly the weight of all the quiet nights when she had stitched by lamplight for mouths that would one day judge her. There was grief in them, and there was an unyielding reserve. The conversation that unfurled after that stretched into the afternoon. They spoke of duties and of the legalities the lawyer had explained. They spoke of the possibility that Maria could claim the inheritance and of the reality that accepting it did not magically change the past. They argued over the idea of public exposure, of how to speak to the lawyer, and over what it would look like if the world discovered the family had once turned away its own. When at last the younger ones stood to leave, they moved as if pulled by the same tug that had thrummed under every choice in the family, a mixture of love, fear, pride, and a wish to control the narrative before it controlled them. They promised to return. They promised, too, to bring answers from the lawyer's office, as if answers might be the scaffold on which they might rebuild their reputations. Maria watched them go and felt for the first time in a long while the stirrings of something she had not allowed herself to name, not triumph, but a tempered hope that the life she had led might now be held with a different kind of respect. She did not want money for herself. She wanted to see whether the children would accept the terms of character she had always believed were far more valuable than any ledger. That night, as she sat with the wooden box open and the letters spread like a map, she began to compose a decision in her mind. It would not be an act of vengeance. It would not be a way to punish. It would be a test, not cruel, but firm, meant to shape what had been shaped poorly for too long. If a will could be an instrument of balance, she thought, then perhaps it could also be a tool to teach humility. Somewhere in the city, the lawyer closed his briefcase and prepared the next day's steps.
He had done his work with the clarity of someone accustomed to documentary truth. He did not assume the world would react with anything other than interest when the story broke. He merely kept notes, kept appointments, and waited for the legal machinery to run its course. But the story has a way of surviving the tidy hands of bureaucracy. Small towns remember, and choices made in private can spill outward without warning. The public is hungry for redemptions and scandals in equal measure. The children, who had once thought themselves inedible to embarrassment, were about to learn a new hunger, the hunger for humility. On the porch of Lucia and Antonio's house, the night air was heavy with damp and expectation. Maria closed the wooden box and tied the letters gently. She laid the small keepsakes back inside, as if returning each to its proper place. Outside, the world continued to thin into quiet. Inside, she sat and considered the path ahead, a decision to be made, not only about money, but about the kind of people her children might become. She placed the lid on the box and, for the first time in many sleepless years, allowed herself to be still. The next day would require courage and a measure of legal navigation she had not yet begun. It would require facing the past and confronting the future. It would require patience. Down the road, headlights cut through the dark as the siblings drove toward answers, toward apologies, toward a reckoning that would not be clean. The will had arrived like a key dropped onto the floor. It made a sound you could not unhear. And as the town settled into its restless sleep, something had shifted. One family's ordinary life was now poised on the edge of a transformation that would test everything they claimed to hold dear. Dawn came slow and pale over the town, a thin promise of light after a night that had shifted everything. The house where Maria had once lived was quieter now, but not settled. The hairs on the back of a few necks stood up as if they could still feel the echo of what had happened. Dr. Steven Almeida had filed his notes and returned to the tidy organization of his office, yet the case did not feel tidy to him. He found that part of the work of law, especially when it bumped against real people, was to become the carrier of awkward truths. He could present documents, verify signatures, explain procedure. He could not soften the sting of having a mother's dignity questioned in front of neighbors. By mid-morning, Steven walked up the sagging steps of Lucia and Antonio's porch with an envelope folded into his palm like a formal bird. He had been instructed by his staff to move carefully. The will was clear in a legal way, but the human part, the one that would require a woman with a lifetime of choices to decide how to use sudden resources, was another territory entirely. Maria rose from the chair by the stove when they knocked.
There was a steadiness in the way she walked, a slow refusal to be hurried, as if she had all the time in the world to decide things that mattered. Antonio poured coffee without ceremony. Lucia watched the exchange with the sort of curiosity that had the kindness of a neighbor more than the prying of gossip. Stevan introduced himself again, his voice measured, and explained with the minimum of legal jargon the facts. The will named her as sole heir to the estate of Augusta Cavalcante. The executor had verified the document. The estate's assets included property and funds that could be used for the family's benefit and for public works attached to the name of the late patriarch. Maria listened. She handled the envelope as if it were a relic of a different life, and when Stevan asked her if she wished to see the will, she only nodded. She unfolded the paper with fingers that had mended clothing and patched old linens more often than they'd held legal instruments. There was an executor's signature, a notation that parts of the estate had been designated for charitable ventures, and a clause that left discretion to the heir over certain portions. "It is all here," Stevan said softly. "Legally, you have the right to accept and administer this legacy as you see fit. There are formal steps we must follow, but there is also the matter of who will be the administrators if you choose not to do that yourself." Maria read. The letters and dates in the margin were small notations of an order that once knitted with the life she had walked away from. When she folded the paper back, the decision that was forming in her had no surprises of cruelty in it. She had not lived through years of small sacrifices in order to set traps for her children. What she wanted, what had always mattered, was to see whether those who called her mother would become people whose lives held up to the meaning of that name. "Thank you," she told Stevan, and he took the words as both answer and beginning. Word of the legal meeting at Lucia and Antonio's traveled the way small-town news often did, faster than official channels, slower than rumor. The children knew the lawyer had been there, and so they returned, cautious and desperate in different measures. They wanted the estate, of course, but more than that, their ears were tuned to the part of life that might rescue them from the shame of what they had done. They wanted to be able to edit the memory of that day into something more palatable. When they returned, Maria met them not on the porch, but at the little table where she had once sorted letters and memories. There was a gravity in the air that was not accusation. It was the weight of history settling into a new shape. "I have read the document," she said. The three children listened with many kinds of hope folded into their faces. "I did not seek this. 70 years of choices are not unraveled with a signature, but a life is made up of more than money.
It is made by what we do with what we are given." Marina had rehearsed phrases she thought might make the moment easier. Promises of better behavior, careful plans for public relations, a plan to present gifts to friends who might be skeptical. Michel had already imagined how he would use the resources to expand businesses and regain social footing. Juliana, who had cried the week before on a stranger's porch, wanted only a mother back near the table. Maria placed the wooden box between them, the letters whispering up like old answers. Then, speaking as a woman who had weighed decisions over long nights and cold floors, she told them what she intended to do. "I will accept what is mine," she began. Her voice was clear, not loud. "But I will not accept it in a way that returns us to what we were. I will not be an instrument of shame, nor will I use this to crush you. I have 3 conditions. They are not cruel. They are necessary." She paused long enough for each of them to feel the burden of the pause. "First, each of you will spend 1 full year engaged in honest, humble work that serves people directly. Not in offices remote from others, but where you must sit with the public, feel the heat and cold of hands, and learn what it is to be truly helpful." "A year?" Marina asked, as if the measure of time might be a trick. "A year of labor," Maria answered. "You will accept roles that you do not command into. You will answer to someone who is not you. Second, you will live simply for that year. Sell what exceeds your needs. Move to modest homes. Keep only what you truly use. Simplicity asks if we can be content with enough." Michelle's jaw tightened. "Are you asking us to give up everything?" "I am asking you to rearrange your lives," Maria said. "Privilege must be tested by sacrifice to be learned. Simplicity shows you where your heart lives." "And the third?" Juliana whispered. "Every Sunday you will come to this table," Maria said, and she said the words as if they had always been a prayer. "Not a formal meal, a shared one. We will eat together, we will speak among the dishes about what we have learned. There will be no phones, no guests who are not family, and you will stay for the whole hour. This is the part of our family I think the world forgot how to do." There it was. 3 conditions stated with the plainness of someone who had stitched hems and mended sleeves for a lifetime. The children heard it as if each clause were a small hammer tap, making a sound they could not unhear. Michelle's face was a storm of calculation. "You can't force us to work," he said. "If you sign the documents, the money is ours." "You will have shares," Maria acknowledged, "but the distribution will be conditional. I can create trusts and conditions in the allocation of funds. I will arrange the estate so that portions are released upon completion of these conditions. The legal team will help manage this. This will not be humiliation." "It will be a test, yes, but one that gives you the chance to learn." Marina's eyes filled then, a sudden realization of what she had lost and what she might gain. "You mean, if we don't do it?" she began, and her voice broke on the edge of fear. "I mean, I will give the people what they need," Maria said simply. "I will use what I can to build something that helps others. Half of the estate will be given to causes I have long wanted to support: a community hospital wing, a foundation for women in need, and a fund to support apprenticeships for young workers. Whatever does not go to those projects will be managed so that each of you receives what is right in due time, contingent upon the choices you make." Stevan sat quietly at the edge of the conversation, dispatching legal clarity when necessary, and otherwise allowing the family to speak. He understood, in that small house warmed by a neighbor's stove, that what Maria had proposed was legally feasible. A sole heir, empowered by a will, and supported by an executor, could indeed direct the distribution with moral conditions and trusts that released funds over time and according to milestones. There would be paperwork. There would be officials. There would be no instant cinematic transfer of gold, but legal mechanisms existed to ensure her wishes were carried out. 1 year, Michelle said again, as if trying to negotiate the length into something that could be purchased with a promise to change. What kind of work? Where? Maria smiled at him as if at a small child who still needed the contour of the world explained. The work will be assigned. The foundation will require volunteers and staff in hospitals, community kitchens, shelters, and apprenticeship projects. You will be placed where your absence of experience is matched by a need for service. You're making us beg to serve, Marina said, wounded and oddly relieved. I'm giving you a chance to learn, Maria answered. A life can change in a year if the hands that build it define new patterns. Juliana, whose remorse had always been quick to surface, reached across the table. I will do it, she said quietly. I will go wherever needed. I don't want money if it means we don't change. Marina and Michelle exchanged a glance that had within it all the complexity of pride and fear. They would agree, reluctantly, nervously, with footnotes of resistance, but in those first moments they also felt something like hope. There were legal documents to sign. Dr. Almeida drew up trust instruments, clauses for the release of funds, and a structure for the creation of a foundation. Marina chose to keep control of the foundation's charter, but she named Lucia and Antonio as part of the initial board of trustees, along with a small group of people she trusted, Donna Cansisang among them, so that the estate's public works would be led by those who knew the town's true needs. A press release went out a week later.
The initial shock gave way to a new kind of attention. The narrative that would have been a simple scandal, the children who threw out their mother, became something more complicated in the papers. A woman of modest appearance who had chosen to use inherited wealth for the public good and to demand character building from those nearest to her heart. There were critics, always there are critics, and there were others who applauded, and halfway in between, people simply watched. The year began with hesitation, and then slowly, effort. The children who had once measured value by status found themselves in places where status was not a currency. Michelle was placed at a community construction site contracted by the foundation to build a health clinic in a neighborhood that had few services. He, who had once directed projects with a clipboard and a phone, now slept in a modest rented room, wore work boots he didn't particularly like, and learned to mix concrete with hands far less steady than his had ever been. The foreman, an older man named Huang, who had taught kids to use tools and to respect the slow work of building, didn't much care for diplomas. Huang cared for whether a wall leaned true and whether you carried a beam for a neighbor, not for whether you had private equity experience. Michelle found the work exhausting and humiliating at first. He was impatient. He had been born into transactions and convenience. The workers at the site eyed him with the kind of skepticism that matches the town. He had to earn their trust. There were moments when his old reflexes kicked in, attempts to bend rules, to substitute shortcuts, to call in favors, and nearly every time the sound of Maria's voice in his memory held him back. He remembered, unexpectedly, how he had left his mother in the rain. He imagined the thin thread that had been used to bind his son's childhood to comfort, now frayed. One afternoon, a boy named Lucas, a teenager apprenticed to Huang, cut his hand on a rusted nail. Blood and fear made the work slow. Michelle had the sense of urgency of someone who feared being judged for ineptness. He sat with the boy while Huang fetched bandages, and in the small heat of the temporary shed, Michelle found himself speaking quietly to Lucas, not as a man lecturing about productivity, but as someone who had been pushed into an unexpected place of care. Lucas had never been asked by a man of Michelle's old circle to be seen as anything other than another body to labor. Michelle learned to listen. He learned that leadership could be on knees repairing a wound, not simply behind a ledger. Marina's path took her into a different kind of humiliation, stripped of the glamour she had once used as armor. The foundation placed her at the hospital wing Maria insisted the estate fund, the pediatric outpatient clinic that had been a dream in the letters tucked in Maria's wooden box.
At first, Marina could only see the messy details, so many families without the polished manners she was used to receiving. She found herself at reception, filling forms, learning medical jargon she once derided as mundane. She was placed under the supervision of a nurse named Rosa, a woman whose kindness was not sentimental, but exacting. Rosa taught Marina the small protocols, how to hold a frightened parent's hand without offering a platitude, how to explain a treatment patiently, how to help a child feel brave when everything is unfamiliar. Marina's first weeks were a series of missteps, forms misplaced, appointments double booked, a hurried apology to a mother who had already been waiting for hours with a fevered child. She learned something in the quiet hum of the hospital's fluorescent lights. She learned that competence was a muscle built by daily repetition, and empathy was not emotion alone, but discipline. Juliana, perhaps the quickest in the early stages to understand the depth of the mistake, was assigned to the community center's after-school program, teaching small children to read and to make paper boats. She had the advantage of a heart that broke easily and mended quickly. The after-school room was noisy, smelling of crayons and warm glue. Juliana's hands, once used to arranging parties and polishing silverware for dinners she hosted, found a contentment in the smallness of school supplies and sticky palms. Children who had never been read to looked at stories as if they were maps. Juliana relished the first time a child sounded out a word and saw their eyes widen into a new universe. The first dinner was awkward. They came together as Maria had mandated. The table was modest, the food warmed instead of arranged, and there were silences that hovered like unfinished stitches. But the action of sitting, of being present, of telling small truths about their days, began to do the work that grand speeches do not. It carved new grooves into habit. Weeks became months. The community watched with a mix of skepticism and admiration. For every moment of genuine effort, there were relapses, old habits clawing at the mind like small, insistent animals. Michel would at times catch himself reflexively counting hours like a businessman comparing profit, and Marina would instinctively reach for a cleaner scarf in a needy environment, and Juliana sometimes wanted the applause of a dinner guest rather than the grateful smile of a child. Yet the year, by its nature, expands or contracts into the life you give it. The children discovered that humility demands not a one-time surrender, but daily decisions. They met people whose lives were knotted by the complexities of the town. Single mothers who juggled 2 jobs, men whose injuries had cost them pensions, teenagers with the weight of caring for younger siblings. These were not stories from a book. They were laboring, living human beings.
Their tasks were not opportunities to be charitable from distance, but were instances that required competence and patience. There were moments of particular turning. For Michelle, it came when the clinic's roof needed a repair in a thunderstorm. The crew worked through the rain, and Michel, who had once feared water on his shoes, found himself climbing a ladder to hand a tile to a man he had once judged as inferior. The act of handing the tile, of trusting another's balance and pain, broke his old arrogance like a brittle shell. He began to speak to the workers at lunch, not as someone who owned a project, but as someone learning how to be a part of it. He learned to enjoy the small laughter that grew out of shared work, the kind that indicates respect, not submission. Marina's moment came when a woman walked into the pediatric clinic holding a newborn whose mother had never been to school. The child's fever was high, and the mother had the look of someone who had been taught not to hope. Marina sat with her, filled forms slowly, waited on the results, and held a hand that had hardly known trust. When the doctor's quiet verdict came and the mother wept with gratitude, Marina felt a swelling different from the pride of polished guests. It was the humble bloom of someone who had been useful at a small but crucial hour. Juliana's turning came in a child's first created sentence. A boy named Pedro, who had shuffled into the program with shoes too big for his feet and a tongue clipped by fear, said the word home, the way you say a prayer. Juliana, sitting on the floor with a glue-stained apron, watched his face light as if he had found a place inside himself to grow. She realized that small constancies, one afternoon a week of reading, one voice saying well done, rearranged a child's future. She could not unsee that she had been part of creating the possibility. Not everything went smoothly. There were nights they fought, days when the discomfort of a modest life felt like a punishment. Marina felt the sting of being snubbed by old friends who did not come to her charity's openings. Michel once nearly walked back to his old life at the edge of the year when a business contact offered him a lucrative short-term deal that would have required him to skip the foundation's monthly review. For an instant, the old calculation glittered like a lure. Then he thought of the boy at the construction site whose laugh now greeted him by name. He refused. It was a small refusal, But like most small refusals that matter, it was a hinge. Sunday dinners, kept like a ritual, became the crucible where the interior work took shape. At first, talk hovered over logistics and grievances. They recounted the petty humiliations and the pride that had been stripped. But gradually the conversation deepened.
They spoke of children they'd met, of stories of addiction and recovery, of the stubborn courage of the elderly who sat in clinic chairs and told stories as if each was a treasure. Maria listened with a face that had less desire to judge than to calibrate. She asked questions that asked less for confession than for recognition. "Who did you help this week?" she would ask, not to tally deeds, but to invite testimony. "I sat with Mrs. Pereira while she had an IV," Marina would say, and the table would nod. "I taught Lucas how to set a tile straight," Michelle would reply, humbly proud of a skill that had been more than a transaction. "I read Pedro's first sentence," Juliana would announce, as if it were a festival. The small acts became their testament. The year resolved into habits. When the calendar ticked forward and the last Sunday of the year arrived, there was a sense among the siblings that something heavy had been left somewhere by the roadside, a worn coat of entitlement that no longer fit. They were not perfect, of course. Pride scars take longer to fade, and there were still moments of calculation. But in unexpected hours, they found themselves doing work that required patience rather than applause, and that slow, steady practice reshaped them. When the year formally ended, Maria called a meeting. She would not make a spectacle of the ceremony. She did not love spectacle. But she wanted a moment that marked the legal, social, and personal conclusion to a year intentionally spent. Steven organized the legal instruments that would release the next tranche of shares to the siblings in accordance with the trust Maria had put into place. The community came in small numbers: Lucia and Antonio, Dona Conceição, Joan the foreman, Rosa the nurse, some of the children from the after-school program, and a smattering of neighbors who had watched the family reform like a season changing. Maria stood as simply as she had always stood, with hands seasoned by a life of labor and love. She did not speak at length. Her words were short and held the weight of everything she had lived. "I asked you to change your lives," she said. "You did. You didn't do it perfectly, and you didn't do it all the time, but you did it. That is enough to prove not that you are now saints, but that you are teachable." She handed each of them a small folded letter she had written. The letters were private, pocket-sized accounts of memories, small remembrances of things she had noticed about each of them as children, and hopes for what they might become. It was a mother's way of saying that change was possible, and that love remained. The release of funds followed the legal work Steven had arranged. The estate's money set up the hospital wing fully funded, covered the initial cost to open a community foundation, and placed endowments to pay for apprenticeships and scholarships. Maria chose to give half the estate to public works and used a portion to keep a simple house as her own base in town. She named Lucia and Antonio and a few community trustees to the foundation's board, ensuring that decisions would be led by people who knew the town's rhythms. The siblings used their shares differently. Marina invested part of hers back into the hospital's outreach program and took an administrative role to keep the clinics running efficiently. Michel used his portion to start a small construction cooperative that hired apprentices from neighborhoods that had few opportunities, paying attention to fair wages and training. Juliana invested in after-school programs and literacy initiatives, setting up a small mobile library that went into neighborhoods where books were scarce. The town's view of the family shifted again. Some old friends returned, humbled and curious. The press chronicled the hospital's opening and the foundation's first scholarships. People who once whispered about scandal now spoke in tones that combined amazement and relief. Maria's name, which had once been the local token of small shame in a family argument, became associated with a story of measured justice. The inauguration day of the new hospital wing was, by Maria's standards, a simple affair. There were a few speeches, a quiet one by the town's mayor, a measured thanks by a doctor who had long wished for better pediatric facilities, and a short acknowledgement by Steven, who noted that legal instruments sometimes could be directed toward public good. Maria did not speak at length. She cut the ribbon with hands steady enough to surprise those who had known her as merely quiet. When the ribbon fell away, the applause was not thunderous. It was the kind of applause that comes from people who have watched need met and know it will be there tomorrow when they take a child in for a checkup. The real applause was in the small gestures: a nurse wiping a tear, a mother hugging her child, a foreman standing straight. On that night, the family gathered again at the modest table in Maria's small house for dinner. The space was warm with the smell of broth and fresh bread.
Lucia had made a stew like the one she had always made, unostentatious, generous in its own way. The children, who had once thought wealth was the sum of objects, now counted what they had learned in conversations. Michel, who had been changed most visibly, perhaps because his fall from status was sharp, spoke up quietly. "I thought the year was going to be unbearable punishment," he admitted, "but I learned something about people's courage. I thought I was the kind of man who could manage anything, and I didn't realize how small my world was." Marina reached across and took his hand, and for a moment the table sat in a silence heavy with gratitude. Juliana laughed then, a sound that had the light of someone who had seen too many small victories not to celebrate them.
They shared stories of the year, the boy who first learned to hammer, the mother who wept in the clinic's hall, the child who read a sentence alone in an after-school room. The stories were small and human, reminders that a life is changed not in headline-making moments, but in countless tiny exchanges. Maria listened to them speak, smiling sometimes, eyes steady. When they finished, she simply said, "We used what was given, not to shop for more comforts, but to mend a few holes. That is how wealth should work, to build places where people can breathe." Later, when the meal had ended and the dishes were sitting to soak, the siblings stayed at the table, as if reluctant to end what had become their true inheritance. They did not dissolve into sentimentality. Their lives had practice now in the hard reality of doing good. They also had scars. Public memory does not erase itself, and they would carry the knowledge of the day they threw their mother into the rain. They had learned in the discomfort of the year how to hold that memory and let it teach them, rather than define them. The foundation Maria had built continued to grow, managed in the beginning by a small board that included the neighbor couple and Donna Conceição. The hospital wing became a place where mothers brought infants and where apprentices learned trades that paid a living wage. The cooperative Michel started aimed to train workers who could build more clinics and community centers. Juliana's mobile library taught children to read under awnings and in small parks. Maria's estate was not a show of personal accumulation. It became the seed of public work. There were hard days. Foundations need management. Hospitals need funds. People who once tasted privilege sometimes found the discipline of giving and administrative work less satisfying than the illusion of control. Yet what grew under Maria's measured guidance was not the bauble of fame, but a slow ecosystem of care. Years later, when Maria was older and the town had more than one story to tell about her, people would still whisper about the day her children had forced her into the rain. But the whispered narrative had been complicated, ruined perhaps in the sense that the children's private lives of entitlement had been dismantled and redirected, restored in the sense that the family had found a way to knit itself back with sturdier thread. Michel's businesses became different. They traded less in spectacle and more in community development. Marina kept a part of her time at the hospital and part in the foundation's administration, and she learned that leadership was measured by quiet competence and by how many people were brought along with a project. Juliana's program spread to neighboring towns. They all carried scars and humility in different measures, but they carried also lives that had been tested, and by the tests, remade.
In the end, Maria's legacy was less a ledger and more a set of choices that multiplied into civic good. She did not become famous in the way the papers celebrate celebrities. Instead, she was known in the clatter of clinic halls and at the corner of children's reading rooms. Her face, weathered, lined, steady, was seen in photographs of the hospital opening, not as an ornament, but as a witness. On the day the foundation celebrated its 5th anniversary, a small plaque was unveiled at the hospital's entrance. It bore the name of the foundation and a short phrase Maria had requested, "For those who choose love over ledger." People leaned in to read it. For some, it stirred memories of the arrogance that had been on display years before. For others, it signaled that a hard lesson had been learned. The 3 siblings, now different in posture and speech, stood together and heard the applause that came not for them, but for the work. There was no easy revenge, no humiliation left to savor. Instead, there was the sustained labor of community care. That perhaps was what it meant to have one's life ruined, the old life dismantled and rebuilt into one that had to answer to other people's needs. On a small, ordinary evening years after the first rain, Maria sat at the modest table with the same 3 children, now grown into different versions of themselves. The wooden box, worn with time, sat in a cupboard. She had kept it only as a quiet reminder of choices she had made long ago. They ate simply,
their plates full with the exacting contentment of people who had learned to measure joy and purpose differently. "Do you know," Maria said softly, looking at each of them, "that I do not keep an account of your failures. I keep a ledger of the small steps you took. That is what matters to me." Mikkel, whose life had been reshaped from pride into service, reached across and held his mother's hand. "We were wrong," he said without ceremony. "We were blind. You taught us humility. It cost us much. It made us better." Marina nodded, eyes bright with the steady knowledge that comes from years of daily diligence. Juliana smiled, small and bright as ever. The house smelled of broth, bread, and a little wildness of garlic. How ordinary and how sacred. Outside, children played in a street that had been changed by the presence of the clinic, and the town carried on with its human rhythms. The foundation maintained its work. The hospital saw each day the small miracles of care. The siblings who once thought status would protect them found that their true goods were the ones they had to keep with care: compassion, responsibility, and the habit of showing up. When the meal ended, they sat a while longer. No speeches were necessary. The work they had done for a year and the way their lives had been rebuilt was testimony enough. Their story did not end in public spectacle.
It continued in the daily commitments, in the hiring of apprentices, in the Saturday classes at the mobile library, in the weekly checkups at the clinic. As the lights dimmed and the town moved toward sleep, Maria looked at her children, not as people she had once mended, but as people who had learned to mend others. There was a quiet pride in her face, not the public kind, but the private, enduring warmth of someone who has built something that will outlast the smallness of a single argument. The last thing she had wanted when she walked into the rain with 2 suitcases years ago had not been retribution. She had wanted to be a mother who taught by example. Her will, her instrument of balance, had not destroyed lives forever. It had dismantled old comforts and rebuilt them with something that could sustain more than one household, a community. If you find yourself thinking of their story, if the image of a mother walking away with 2 battered suitcases and wet hair lingers, remember that sometimes the loudest lessons come after the storm. Pride can be softened by service. Shame can become a teacher if we refuse to let it anchor us in bitterness. And wealth, when wielded as a tool for good, can remake not just a bank account, but a town. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that true riches are found in humility, service, and family, and consider subscribing for more stories of quiet transformation.